Hi, everybody. Welcome to Statistics Solutions webinar on Chapter 5, the discussion. Okay. All right. Before we get going, I just want to say that I'm going to put this. Okay. Sorry. That's the slide I want. Just a little bit about who we are. We're a full service dissertation consulting service. We offer a range of services. This is our contact information, which I'll share again at the end. You're welcome to go to our website, see what we offer, but the best way to find out what we offer is just to, if you're interested, is to make an appointment for a consultation. Somebody will talk to you about what we offer and prices. Of course, there's no obligation. That's a free consult. Okay. Now, before we get started too, I also want to say that this, the webinar should be mailed to you. This webinar, it is also available on our website where the webinars are archived. This webinar and other webinars are archived there for different chapters, different topics. Okay. All right, let's get started. Okay, this is what we're going to be covering today. Our kind of guidelines or model for the social sciences dissertation is based on the 5-chapter model, where chapter 1 is the introduction, chapter 2 is the literature review, chapter 3 is where you talk about your methods, chapter 4 is where you present your results, and chapter 5 is where you discuss your results. Now, sometimes there are variations to that. Sometimes dissertations will have more chapters. Sometimes the discussion chapter, for example, is split into 2, where you talk about some of the sections of the discussion in one chapter and some of the sections in the other chapter. But our kind of 5, not ours, but the one we adhere to, the 5 chapter model is pretty standard. Okay. Right. And we have someone on co-host online right now who's in the webinar chat box is putting where you can access the webinars on the website. Great. Thank you. Okay, so this is these are the typical sections of the discussion. And again, like I said, just to pan back, the purpose of the discussion chapter, in chapter 4, you present your results. And in chapter 5 is where you discuss your results, right? Hence the name discussion. There's also some other components to that. It's not just discussing your results. It's kind of talking about limitations that may have affected results. It's also talking about things like implications for practice, recommendations for further research. So there are more components. And we'll get into, as we move forward, a little bit more about what discussing the findings means, because, folks who obviously you haven't written a dissertation before, and sometimes what it means to discuss the findings is a little unclear. Okay. So, like any other chapter, we're going to start out with the introduction. Usually you want to restate, the introduction basically is it's going to introduce the chapter, but it's going to reorient the reader about what you did. So to do that, it's useful to restate the purpose of your study. Remind the reader of the importance of your study and why it was needed. That's going to sound a lot like the research problem. And then you can preview contents of the chapter if you like. Introduction is pretty quick, probably less than a page. Now, you can hear me say this several times throughout the presentation. even though we're going to present you with pretty general features and characteristics of the chapter, you always want to, if you haven't already, obtain your school's template for the chapters and follow that, because there might be some slight variations. But this is usually what the introduction involves. Okay, so not real involved. Okay, the next section is typically called something like the interpretation of the findings, or it can even be called discussion, within the discussion chapter. But this is where you talk about your findings and you discuss your findings, you interpret your findings. And what does it mean to do that? I mean, we found that sometimes folks are kind of a little unclear what that means, and they end up kind of repeating some material from chapter 4 because they're a little unsure what goes in this section and what it means to actually, interpret your findings. So what that largely means is discussing your findings in relation to some of the major findings from previous research. And that's going to be found in your chapter 2. And this is the connection between the chapter 5 and the chapter 2. You want to discuss your findings in relation to some of the major findings of previous literature to note whether your findings support that research, whether it doesn't support the research, whether it maybe adds something new, wasn't in the research before. You may also want to talk about your findings in relation to your theory. Sometimes your school, your chair wants you to do that. So let's dig a little bit deeper into this section, see how to organize it. Okay, so usually you want to organize it with subheaders that are based on your research questions, if it's quantitative, or on your themes, if it's qualitative. Okay, so let's just take one here. Let's just take, quantitative first. So research question 1, restate your research question, summarize the findings, right? Very, matter of fact, statistics free, mostly statistics free. Your statistics are going to be in chapter 4. Chapter 5 is mostly a plain spoken chapter that doesn't involve a lot of statistics, if any. So just kind of really simply relate the findings of, say, your research question 1. And then you want to discuss that finding for that research question or for that theme, if it's qualitative, in relation to some of the major findings, previous findings that you have in chapter 2. And you want to note, one of the important things you want to note is whether your findings support previous research, do not support, or again, in some cases, you might have found something totally new or novel, and that's worth indicating. So, what I found for research question 1, whatever it happens to be, largely supports the research, previous research. And then you talk about that previous research, right? For example, Smith, 2017, and describe Smith's study a little bit and what Smith found. And then if there's some more that's connected to your research, that your research supports, you bring that in too, right? So bring in all the research that supports, if it supports, or doesn't support, if it doesn't support, or sometimes it's mixed, right? So, findings on a specific topic could be mixed. Some people have found, some researchers found that there's significance. Some people found that there's not significance. So whichever kind of side your finding falls on, you would want to discuss it in relation to that literature. And if your findings largely support previous research, you can usually make a conclusion based on that, whatever it is you found, because previous research says A, and your research also supports A. right? So therefore, whatever whatever A is about, your research, you can conclude that yes, that's A is actually confirmed, whatever A happens to be. If the findings are mixed, or if your findings don't support previous research, that's fine. Sometimes people kind of get a little alarmed when, I didn't find significance, or my findings didn't support the research. It's like, that's okay. You're objective researcher, you're getting, whatever your study indicates is what you're getting, and that's fine. That still tells us something. If your findings don't support previous research, that's fine. It just suggests that there's still some kind of inconclusiveness about the topic or whatever it is that you studied, which may indicate the need for further research. Okay, so you do that for research question 1 or theme 1 if it's qualitative. Then you move to the next theme or to the next research question. Okay, until you hit them all. And so your interpretation of the finding section is going to have a very it's going to be a very reader friendly, and it's going to be very writer friendly structure. Okay, for you. Here's research question 1, here's a research question 2, or here's theme 1, here's theme 2, etc., until you cover them all. Because if you don't do it that way, it's going to, if you start to kind of talk about all your findings together, it's going to get confusing. It's going to get confusing to the reader. It's going to get confusing to you. So again, this is a really reader-friendly, writer-friendly way to do it. And this is kind of what your professors expect anyway, that it's laid out in a very organized manner, and that it proceeds in a way that's very clear and easy to follow. Okay. If your findings, again, like if you found something that's novel or new, indicate that. That's important. Also, where your findings don't agree with previous research, again, that's fine, and it suggests some inconclusiveness, but usually there needs to be at least a brief explanation of why your findings may be different. Okay, it may involve the population, that it's a different population, so that you used in researchers have used in previous studies, and that may have made a difference. Or there's something in the literature that might help you support why your findings may be a little different, but you should offer some kind of explanation. Now, it's nothing that's going to be able to be proved to be true, but it's just going to be an explanation why your findings may have been different from those of previous research. Also, the theory, if you use the theory or theories, your theoretical framework, this is kind of, this one is kind of usually chair dependent. Sometimes your chair really wants you to talk about your theory in relation to your findings, and that's fine. Sometimes you can kind of intersperse it when you're talking about your findings in relation to previous research. You can kind of bring the theory in where it's appropriate to do so, or you may have you could have a different section and just call it connection to theory or links to theory or something, and just have a section where you talk about the theory in relation to your findings. Some chairs don't mind if you leave it out, so the theory part is going to kind of leave it up to you, or you and your chair. And the idea here is, theories are meant to explain things. So does your theory kind of connect with what you found? Does what you found support the theory? Okay, and if it supports the theory, then you conclude that, yeah, this theory is relevant to what I studied. If your findings don't support or don't match up with the theory, it may indicate that, well, maybe in this case the theory wasn't adequate, or wasn't the right theory to to explain what you did, and it may indicate that the theory may need to be modified, or maybe that researchers in the future need to look at different theories to use. Okay, so that's the interpretations of the finding section, and that's the heart of the chapter, right? I mean, that's the most kind of important part of the chapter, because the things that you're going to talk about next not so much the limitations, but the implications for practice, the recommendations for further research are going to be based on the findings and your discussion of the findings. Okay, so next section, limitations. Sometimes the limitations can be kind of incorporated into the interpretation of the findings section. That's fine. Sometimes schools like to have a separate limitation section, which is fine too. Again, follow your template. But at some point in the chapter, you're going to need to discuss limitations, right? I mean, all studies have limitations, and limitations are weaknesses or shortcomings or something that may have influenced your findings, right? So a big limitation for quantitative studies, for example, is low sample size, right? If you have a low sample size, your study is underpowered, that's going to affect the statistical certainty of your findings, of your results. So that is worth noting. I mean, limitations are they're things you should acknowledge, right? It doesn't mean your study is irrelevant. It doesn't mean your data isn't accurate. It just means that the readers should, interpret your results with these limitations in mind. Another thing you can do for limitations is somewhere in probably either in chapter 1 or chapter 3 or both, maybe. You may have a limitation section in there when you wrote the proposal. And of course, that was forward looking. You didn't, you were thinking about what might be limitations at the time. And you can go back to those sections and see if what you thought may have been limitations actually ended up being limitations now that you've completed your study. But anything that may have affected your results would be mentioned in the limitations. Usually in the limitations too, they want you to discuss the generalizability of your results to the larger study population. So in other words, how likely are these the results going to transfer or generalize to the larger study population? Usually quantitative studies, if your sample size was adequate, generalizability should be pretty good. Now there are some things that influence that, like your recruiting method, like random sampling. If you did random sampling, that increases generalizability because it's a random selection of people that probably is more representative. Things like convenience sampling probably decrease your generalizability a little. But again, if it's quantitative and you met your sample size, chances are your findings are going to generalize pretty well. If your study is qualitative, your findings will not generalize well, and that is by design. You can mention that. Qualitative studies typically have low samples, 8 people, 10 people, 12 people, because you're doing interviews. If you're doing interviews, you can't interview 100 people, right? It's just too much. So you have a low sample size by design because you're interviewing people, you're getting their in-depth, perceptions, you're getting their in-depth discussions on their experiences, right? Those in-depth perceptions and insights. So it's meant to get that kind of information, that in-depth information that quantitative studies with large sample sizes cannot get. So the shakeout is that while your qualitative results offers good insights into the topic, they're not going to generalize. And that's okay. If you just mention it that way, you should be fine, because again, they're not meant to generalize. Okay, usually there's a section called implications for practice. Now this has to do with the value of what you found, right? The value of your research, the value of your findings. And there's 2 real sections we'll talk about. One's research and one's practice. So this is about the value that your findings have for practitioners in the area, right? If you're doing an education study, and you looked at why special education teachers leave the field, right? Because there's a problem with them leaving the field. You looked at that, you wanted to know why. You come to this section and you think, well, who would my findings be valuable to? Who would find this information valuable? Definitely special education teachers, right? But also administrators, right? This would be especially valuable to administrators because they could say, oh, they need more professional development. Okay, I better, I want to maybe want to ramp that up at my school. Or it seems like administrative support, they lack administrative support. Well, I want to make sure that they get the support they need. So that's what implications for practice are. How is and to whom are your results valuable? And you can get specific here. What does it mean for these folks, the practitioners at this level? How can the information be distributed? Maybe through, to go back to our example, maybe professional development could be, you could give increased money for conferences. You could have workshops and seminars at the school for professional development, right? So you can kind of get nuts and bolts. You can kind of get, how would this information get the practitioners? You can do that too. So how do your findings affect or relate to people at the level of practice in whatever area that is? Okay, and usually the last section, or sometimes the penultimate section, is recommendations for further research, right? So based on what you found, these aren't general recommendations, right? They're based on two things. They're based on your findings, and they could be based on limitations too. So if you found that, let's see, for one research questions, your findings did not support previous research. Okay, that's fine. That suggests that there's inconclusiveness on that topic, right? So you could recommend further research in that area because of, that suggests that we're still not sure. So anywhere your findings don't align, don't support, you can recommend further research in that area. You could also recommend research on whatever topic you covered, different types of studies, right? So you conducted a quantitative study, a correlational study or something, and you found that these two constructs, whatever you measured, are related. Okay, well, you could recommend, well, we want to dig in, future researchers could dig into this topic more and understand more how these two things are related. You could recommend a qualitative study, right? So you can recommend different types of studies to get different types of information. You could recommend, if you wanted to get a bigger, let's go back to our example on why special education teachers leave the field. If you wanted to recommend, say, a case study, right? A case study would be, you look at a school or a couple of schools and you'd have multiple data sources. You'd maybe interview special education teachers, maybe interview administrators, maybe have a survey, or do something like classroom observations, right? And take field notes. So a case study would allow you to get a bigger picture, like a more comprehensive view of the subject, because it involves multiple data sources. Okay, so just thinking out loud here for, you can recommend different types of studies to get different types of data and different types of information in this section. Also, novel findings, any finding that was like really unexpected or that was new or different or novel, definitely you can recommend more research on that. Also limitations, recommendations can be based on limitations. So for example, the idea here is to, in your limitations, there was some limitation that it may have affected the results. The recommendation section, you can recommend that future researchers replicate your study, but that they make sure that they address whatever limitation that you encountered. Hey, some schools will let you end with that section. Some schools want a summary or a conclusion, which is fine. Again, check your template to see for sure. And this summary is a little different than other chapter summaries because, yes, it is the summary chapter, but it's also the dissertation summary, right? It's a summary of the whole thing. So like other summaries, recap the major points from the chapter, right? But also leave the reader with a take-home message, right? Like the most important things about your study or your findings that you want them to remember. Okay, that's important. I tell people to sell it, sell your findings, sell your study, right? So even if you don't think it was that big of a deal what you found, I mean, you still want to sell it, right? You want to, this is, the importance of what you found. So leave the reader with that, like a sense of what's the most important things about your study that you found that you want them to take away. Okay, and that's the chapter 5, just kind of in a nutshell. Generally, it's not a long chapter. Usually, 10 pages, 10 to 12 pages is usually the sweet spot. So it's not really long. So it's not a chapter that kind of goes on and on, but they want you to have, it needs to be kind of concise. They want you to have, the material that they're asking for in those sections. And again, like I said, maybe 15 pages, 20 pages at the most, but that's kind of pushing it. Like I said, 10 to 12, it's usually typical. Okay. I'm going to leave this up. Again, this is who we are. This is some of the services that we offer. It's our contact information. Get a hold of us if you want to just find out more. Again, it's a free consult. It'll just let you know more about what we offer and if that's right for you. I'm going to leave that up. I'll take questions. If you have any questions, I'll try to answer them. Yeah, if you have questions, just type them in the question and answer box, or even in the chat box. That'd be fine. Any questions? I'll give you a few minutes. Any questions? Everybody's good with the chapter 5 then? All right, everybody, if you're good, I'm going to let you go here, but I want to remind you that we do run webinars often on different chapters, on different topics. So check our website for webinar schedules. Also on the website, we have resources, we have chapter guidelines, we have blogs on different topics and different chapters. So there's a kind of a wealth of information there. Be sure to check our website. And again, check it for blogs. Webinars, different chapters on methodology, research questions, all kinds of things. All right. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and good luck.